Well, hey everybody, it is Wednesday, and that means we are back live for another episode of Level Up Live. So how you doing, Kenneth Edmonds?
I am doing fine.
Yeah, great to see you. And last week I was doing the program solo because you were on a cruise. Which part of the world were you off to then?
Well, we went just a short cruise over to Nassau and to a private island. But what made that cruise unique and special was that's the first time we've seen my granddaughter since the pandemic. She came. She's 16 now, so Grandma and Grandpa don't get quite as much time as we used to. But the result was, as we change that a little bit, we got to spend some time with her. We had a great time, and now we're glad to be back. And for a while, I'll be back in my home office on Wednesdays.
I love it. So Nassau, and as I'm in Canada, that's actually further for me. And that's probably a good segue to your favorite question of the day.
Where are people watching from? Because you never know with me where I am joining from.
Yeah.
In fact, I've got a secret destination I'll be joining from in June. It's land-based, but it'll be a secret till I get there. And the nice thing is I should have great internet.
Well, I can't wait. And maybe you can leave some breadcrumbs along the way to give people hints. Maybe we can do an actual contest.
Okay.
So Greg Walters, hey all, nice to see you, Greg. Thanks for joining in. As always, we love having Greg Walters joining the show. And Greg, I think you're probably still in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. No, he's somewhere else today. He is in a state of bliss. So I want to visit that state sometime soon. I'll join you there, buddy, soon.
Well, he could be on a cruise ship and be in a state of bliss, but I'm not sure about that.
It's absolutely true. And don't forget, folks, to leave your questions and comments. And Ken, I think it's rather appropriate that you mentioned that one of the great things about that trip was that you got to see your family, right? And that's one of the things that we're going to dive into a little bit today is this underdog mentality and how the core values, including the value of family and friends, can be so important. So pretty excited that we've got a great guest today actually joining us. And I'm just going to bring in Mike Sullivan. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Hey, guys. Glad to be here. How are you?
Oh, really well. And cannot thank you enough for joining us today. And so obviously from Loomis, The Voice of the Underdog is the book that Ken and I both had an opportunity to look at. We'll be bringing that up as we certainly go through. But before we go any further, maybe just a brief introduction of yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm Mike Sullivan. I'm the CEO of the Loomis Agency, where I have been for 20 years, which is hard to believe. We call ourselves the country's leading challenger brand agency, advertising agency, that is. And certainly we'll be talking a little bit about challenger brands here today. But yeah, I built my career in advertising and marketing, and I love it. And I think the only thing that I love more than advertising and marketing is leading an advertising and marketing agency. Just the folks in this industry are remarkable. They're creative souls. Always interesting and curious. And so I've been privileged to build a wonderful career alongside these people.
Yeah, it's great. And actually, I was speaking with you before the show that I just love this idea that you have, obviously, as the theme being kind of the underdog, and each one of your folks, including yourself, having a dog avatar, which goes along with the photos. I just think that's so absolutely cool. And speaking about that, maybe you can take us through it for a second. I'll just pop in here a little bit that you wrote the book on this, right? So The Voice of the Underdog, maybe you can take our, people a little bit through what that's all about.
Well, so the full title is The Voice of the Underdog, How Challenger Brands Create Distinction by Thinking Culture First. And so the whole thesis of the book, and we've seen this played out over and over and over with clients over the years, is that culture is a critically important component of brand. The two things are completely linked, and they need to be. A lot of marketers and a lot of business leaders, based on our experience, don't always put those two things together. But culture, a company's culture, informs the behavior of the company, and the way a company behaves essentially becomes the brand. And one of my favorite definitions of a brand is what people think it's like to do business with you. It's really simple. And you can convolute that definition in all kinds of ways. And in this industry, we do. But a brand is what people think it's like to do business with you. Well, that ladders back to behavior. So how are you behaving as an organization? And of course, culture has everything to do with that.
I love that. And go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say, and we can see that because and we can pull up a variety of companies that we think about that when we call them, they're going to aggravate us to no end. Culture,
Right.
They might be a cable company, they might be a phone company, and their culture is such that it is nothing about caring for the customer, and you just hate talking to them.
Ken, that's a great point. And you think about, you just used an example of the phone company, say, or the cable company. How much effort and energy do you think some of these companies put into building their culture? My guess is not a whole lot. They feel like they're going to get the business one way or another, and you kind of get what you get, and there's no real concern about building a culture that promotes specific values. I don't think they show up as values-driven companies. Contrast that with some of our favorite brands like, I don't know, Chick-fil-A or Trader Joe's or REI, and think about the way those experiences make you feel. And then think a little bit about, wow, what kind of effort and energy must they have put into really thinking through what kind of culture they've got that drives this brand, that reinforces everything at every customer touch point. So
yeah, and it makes you want to actually pay more for their services, right? And Chick-fil-A is probably a good example that, my wife and I are in Canada, but we're border rats. So we live close to Buffalo. And one of the first things that we do is head across the border if we're, shopping or visiting places. And one of our stops is Chick-fil-A. A, their food's fantastic, but B, right from the minute you're at the register to when you sit down to everything else, everyone there makes you feel like you're at a 5-star restaurant, which is crazy for a fast food organization, right? So yeah. I love that. And they were certainly a challenger, right? And maybe that's a good segue into the next point, because they came out of nowhere for established brands like McDonald's and Burger King and others, and started dominating large parts of marketing share, right? So maybe we can talk to this a little bit. I know that on your website, let's see if I can do this properly. On your website, you do actually have on your blog section what makes a challenger brand. Maybe we can talk to that a bit.
Absolutely. And Chick-fil-A is a really good example, and absolutely the quintessential challenger brand. Seems like they came out of nowhere, and they kind of did. Just a minute on that, and then I'll talk about what is a challenger brand. And it's not as obvious, I think, as people might think it is, but Chick-fil-A, that experience that you talked a little bit about, again, it was very intentional. I was listening to a radio show rebroadcast years ago with Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A. And he was asked by the show host, he says, Truett, how do you train people to say please and thank you? And, and how do you train people to be so polite? And his answer was just so telling and so right on. He just said, well, I don't train people to say please and thank you. I hire people who say please and thank you. And again, it goes back to just cultural. I've got a template. I know my values, and then I'm hiring to that. When we think of, what a challenger, and that's a brilliant challenger move, really being deliberate about the kind of folks that you want in your organization, what you want them to do, and how you want that to perpetuate your brand experience. When we think about challenger brands, so I always think in sort of three respects. There's state of market, which everybody knows. Okay, so any classically defined, anybody who is not a market leader is a challenger brand. You're a following brand, and we tend to think, okay, well, you're under-resourced, under-capitalized, you don't have all the advantages of the market maker, but you're out there fighting it out. And then we talk a little bit about state of mind, and in a state of mind, it ladders to being the best at something or striving to be the best at something. And you can think about a brand like REI. We're going to be the best outdoor sports gear retailer in the world. But they've got a point of view and a purpose, and they're striving to be the best at something. And then the final one: state of market, state of mind, state of readiness. So this is the willingness for leadership inside these companies to work unconventionally, to disrupt the market, and to really do things differently. I think a lot of people sometimes mistake challenger branding as an advertising thing. They think the old Avis, we're number 2, so we try harder. Yes, that's a great advertising claim, but it was rooted in something fundamentally true about the company. They really did try harder. I mean, back in the day when having ashtrays cleaned out was a big thing in cars, and now we're really dating ourselves. Avis really did all these things. They cleaned the ashtrays, they cleaned the cars in a way that Hertz just wasn't at the time. And so that's why it resonated. You can't simply make a claim. It's got to be rooted in something authentically true. So that's how I'd sum that up. State of market, state of mind, state of readiness. That's what really defines a challenger brand.
I love it. And speaking of that challenger brand, obviously we use some examples which are really B2C. And Greg Walters is asking about any B2B companies that he sees as a challenger with customer-centric culture, right?
Gosh, that's a really good question. You know, on the B2B side, I can think of some that I know that your listeners probably wouldn't be aware of. I can think of local companies.
I've got one. It's a little self-serving because I do work for them. So
Yeah.
that's the first disclaimer. But Tiger Paw Software is a perfect example of a challenger brand coming into a marketplace which is basically 98% owned by a competitor, right? And instead of trying to be the biggest, as this other organization is, they've always been focused on being the best. So they promise, like if you call any customer service, the call is either going to be answered or we're going to get back to you in 5 minutes, right? Those kinds of things, which in this modern age, especially with software companies, don't exist, right? So they're smaller. They're huge on culture. If you look up Tiger Pots right on their website, those cultural values is what drives the organization. So sorry, Greg, I know that's a bit self-serving, but that's why I do work for Tiger Paw Software, is because they are that challenger brand trying to do what's right both for their people and their customers, right?
There you go. That's a great example.
Yeah, I like what Greg just said here too. I'm gonna pop it up. Oh, well.
Yeah, he's listed a couple there too. Great America is another great example. They're a finance organization, right? That typically they're never the cheapest. That's if you're looking for a finance company that's going to be the cheapest for rates and stuff, probably don't call Great America. However, if you want an organization that is absolutely hell-bent on leather to make sure that they're doing more for you for those services related to what's being financed, they're unbelievable, and their culture is absolutely incredible. So that's a good share, Greg. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I was going to say back in the day when I supported Marco in the Upper Midwest, they were at that point in time a relatively small dealership. That's 20 years ago, but they had that mentality that they wanted to be the best. Part of it was they were an ESOP, and I think that was a very motivational piece and a model that companies could learn from, because everybody was vested in the success of the company. And because of that, they really cared. If they ask, and here's a question that I love that they ask. They would ask customers as their survey, based on what happened in our last interaction, whether it was sales or service, would you recommend our company to your friends and family? And a scale of 1 to 5. If it wasn't a 5, a manager went to visit that customer to see what they could have done better.
And I think we've talked about this one a little bit already, Mike, but if there's anything else to add to it, but how challenger brands can use culture to create brand distinction, I think what you shared on the Chick-fil-A side was absolutely critical, as well as the car example. And maybe what I'd like to do, you eat your own dog food, and the pun is fully intended, right? So it's, that your core values, I loved being able to go through them on the website. And maybe what we can do is actually just walk through those for folks. I think it's a good way to demonstrate, sort of what you bring to challenger brands as you help them as well, right?
Yeah, I'd love to do that, because it all starts with values. You've got to get really clear on what your values are, on what's important to you as an organization, as a company. And then you want to invite more people into the organization who share those values, so that this doesn't become sort of accidental. It becomes really intentional. And I think intentionality is what it's all about. And so, you've got on the website our core values. And by the way, I don't know if you can see this, but we've got a little book too. We call this our purpose book at the agency, and everybody's got one of these. And when we're real deliberate, when we onboard people, really it starts even before that. When we recruit people, we talk about our values. We talk about what's important to us. We talk about things like shared success. And shared success means, hey, not just some people in the company are winning, everybody is winning. Where clients are winning, we're winning. We're sharing that. So we don't create winners and losers inside the organization. That may sound pretty basic, but I've been in organizations where there are definitely winners and losers. Not a great feeling. Family and friendship. This is what I love about this one, is that through the pandemic, this has become so obvious to everybody that it's awfully important to be connected with family and friends, and to be taking the personal time to recharge and reflect and all that good stuff. That's been a value of ours for the last 20 years. And so being family focused is great. What does that look like in action? Man, if somebody's, we have for example, unlimited PTO policy. We've got a team approach, and people really check in on one another. If someone's got to be out for a protracted period of time to deal with a family issue, we're able to cover that. And again, we built a culture that supports that. That is mitigated too by high performance. So it's one thing to be all about family and friendship and that sort of thing, but man, we've got a team with high capacity for great work, and we want high performers, and we're explicit about it. And people, there's an old truism: A players like to work with A players. You're on that softball team, and if you're the only one who can play well, it kind of gets boring after a while. You don't want to always be the ringer. It's fun for a minute, but I feel like we've got a team full of ringers, and that really helps us. And then as you scroll, integrity, obviously. And this is something about values too. People say, well, that's not very unique. Integrity, we can all say it, but the way that you manifest that value is unique to you, and it's unique to us as an organization. And so integrity is something that's very important to us, obviously, in our client work. In the world of advertising, there's all sorts of opportunities to obfuscate and to confuse, if you will. We are on the side of transparency and clarity, and that's an important value for us. Growth and development. Ken and I were talking about this just a second ago before the show. It's like sometimes people are moved into positions and they aren't properly trained for those positions. So we're a small company. We're just 65 folks, but we really focus on growth and development, not just from a business standpoint, but from a personal standpoint too. I really think the whole human needs to develop. And so we're big on that. Yeah. Right. And then unity, we kind of have a where we go on, we go all kind of mantra around here. I love that. And that's about pitching in and helping out, not letting someone drown. And all of these values, I think they coalesce into something that has created something pretty special for my company anyway. We're going 8 years strong on a best places to work list for the Dallas Morning News, Dallas Business Journal. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that because I consider that the check on my leadership, and I think that leaders, sometimes we get into positions of leadership and it's like, gosh, who's watching us? If I'm not reporting to a board, or even if I am, are they really watching me? You gotta watch yourself. And from my perspective, being a best places to work environment is critically important. I mean, that's what I set out to kind of create when I started building the agency, and by gosh, we've done it. And so now we got to keep doing it.
I love this idea of growth and improvement. Some of that is professional, some of that's personal. And I'm taken back to one of my favorite leaders, both a friend and a mentor of mine, John McInnes. Obviously, I worked for him for about 5 years, but they had a training policy at his organization at the time, which basically said, I want you to take one business training, something that, kind of applies to your job. And then every time you do that, I'm going to reward you with paying for training for something in your personal life. You want to learn how to play guitar, if you want to do this or whatever that is, right? That balance of, professional and personal, development, right? And actually, putting his money where his mouth is. So absolutely love that. Hey, and I wonder if we can talk for a second. You can hear my Underdog in the background. One of the things that we were talking about at the beginning, this whole idea of how challenger brands, when they really stick to what they're doing, when they are trying to do the right thing and actually be earnest about it. You look at a company like OpenAI, right? Maybe we'll talk about that for a second, because literally a year ago, if you would have asked most people who that organization was, they wouldn't have been able to tell you. No. But it's on the lips of everyone right now. So maybe speak to that as a challenger brand. How does something, like AI, generative AI, disrupt a giant like Google, who is now, really having to, to fight to remain some dominance?
Well, what this really speaks to is, one of the real advantages that challengers have is that category leaders tend to ignore them if they even know that they exist. And now I'm sure that Google and Microsoft were at least vaguely aware, and maybe more specifically aware of OpenAI's efforts. But that is a real advantage for challengers. And I think sometimes we underestimate that, the idea or the ability to fly under the radar, to go undetected until you've got something that is marketable or something that you can unleash on the world. And gosh, that's exactly the way, ChatGPT 3 seemed to just boom. It was on the scene at the beginning of the year, and everybody was talking about it. And certainly in my industry, everybody's talking about it. It's quite disruptive. If you're a writer in any fashion, at least at this point. And by the way, I think writers are out there on the forefront of this thing in terms of being disrupted, but it's coming for everyone at some point. It just is. But again, being able to sort of sneak up on the leaders, they weren't really prepared, they weren't watching it and closely enough, and now they're all playing off the backs of their heels, scrambling because there's a technology in the marketplace that is exactly that, defines the word disruptive, is unconventional, it's flipping the script. And people are trying to figure out how to deal with that. And so it's forcing the market leaders, Google and Microsoft, to react. And that's what a challenger wants. At the end of the day, what you're trying to provoke is a reaction, from your customers, certainly from your competitors. I mean, they're going to react if what you're doing is disruptive enough. And I think that's what we're seeing here. But yeah, that's an exciting and very interesting technology, to say the very least about it.
Yeah.
I want to play on that in just a little bit, because one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit about Microsoft, and we can talk about Microsoft and we'll talk about Google, but then I'm going to talk about our industry a little bit, is that both Microsoft and Google got to such a point of dominance that, in my opinion, they kind of started to rest on their laurels. And I think that's a challenge, is we get this mentality, we're okay, we got it. Yep. And then all of a sudden somebody sneaks up. But I see it in our industry all the time, where companies lose that desire to innovate. And I think that innovation is, based on what we've talked about a little bit before, is part of that underdog mentality. Let's do things different. Let's be the disruptor in our industry. Let's be the people that make everybody else obsolete.
Yep.
Your thoughts on that?
That's right. And then what does it take to make, yeah, there you go. What does it make? What does it take to, thank you, ChatGPT, for writing a little bio of me in 22 seconds, and then what does it take to disrupt? What needs to be disrupted, in a marketplace, looking for those sorts of things. There's a great quote, and I was mentioning it a little while ago, by Michael Eisner, former CEO or chairman of Disney. He said, as long as you think and behave as though you're coming from behind, you've got a shot at staying ahead. And as we were talking about before the show a little bit, I'm from Michigan. I grew up in the Detroit area, and I was a big fan of the auto industry as a kid. And if you look at what GM and Chrysler and Ford really back in the day did, they started to rest on their laurels. Even though Ford's tagline then became "the best never rest," well, they were resting on their laurels, and it really caught up with them when the Japanese moved into the American market and did what they did. And so I think there's a corollary here when you look at Microsoft and Google. Certainly hugely profitable companies, hugely successful, but that success, you've heard the phrase, you can become a victim of your own success. And so, gosh, I don't want to break this model. This model works so darn well, and we're just printing money. Yeah, and that's going to change at some point.
I think Tesla did the same thing, right, for the electrification of cars, and for space. When I think of a challenger brand, even in that space, right, that people would have never believed that someone could make a rocket that would go into space and come back, right? You remember the whole thing about, we got to be able to re-land these things, right? And people said it was impossible. Otherwise, NASA would have done it already, but they believed so much in what they were trying to do that they actually accomplished it, right? And I can see that Greg Walters coming here, Mike's ideas and book ideas can be applied to individual branding, right? So that's an interesting concept.
That's a great question. Yeah. And of course, absolutely. In fact, you look at the world of entertainment, and I don't know why the name just flopped to mind, but it did. You look at like a guy like back in the day, Justin Bieber, using this new technology called YouTube to, boom, he's a challenger brand. I mean, the entertainment industry is full of challenger brands. Just look back in the day at Madonna and the way she changed and evolved her own brand. And I wish I could cite some more contemporary examples. My kids are probably laughing, but still, that absolutely is the answer to that question.
Yeah, and Greg Walters does have a very distinct, personal brand as well. And if you guys are not connected on LinkedIn, I think that you should be. And what did Greg say? I grew up outside of Detroit too.
Nice, Westland. Yeah, Farmington Hills. So, yeah, got it.
Well, that's great. Appreciate that, Greg. And listen, in respect for your time, we are basically have a few minutes left. Can organizations, I'll just throw this out to you, right? Can organizations that are established, can they do the work to become a challenger brand themselves, or is it too late?
Yeah. So I would say, market. Well, so any organization can do the work to become a challenge brand. Absolutely. In fact, I would recommend my book, but there's another book that I'm a big fan of and started this whole journey for me. And it's called Eating the Big Fish by a guy named Adam Morgan. And I would suggest to anybody who's really interested in the subject, I'd love you to start with my book, but really start with Adam's, Eating the Big Fish. It's an excellent read, and it talks about how, there you go. It talks about how companies can embrace the challenger branding ethos and pivot and do these things. And certainly a brand new company, it makes all the sense for. I think the companies that have the hardest time with this are category leaders. The folks who are number one, changing what they're doing, changing culture. It's just a lot harder than it is for smaller, more nimble companies. And again, I think that's an advantage for true and authentic challenger brands on the rise.
I love it.
So I have to share a book, and this is required reading in my class, but it is by a guy named Carl Sewell, and it's called Customers for Life.
Yes.
And I love his ethos and the thoughts he expresses there as well.
It's a classic. Carl Sewell is a classic. Of course, I'm here in Dallas, Texas, and I've bought cars from Sewell, GMC and Sewell Cadillac. And, Carl started with his values, and he built a brand forward from that. And it informed all the behavior that organization has become famous for. So, yes, another one on the screen here, one of my favorite little challenger brands, Golden Chick, local, regional QSR player. But yeah, we're really proud of the work that we've done. We've had the opportunity to work with a lot of just classic challenger brands, from Dairy Queen to Golden Chick here to, all sorts of folks. And it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I got to tell you, it's very seldom that I'm impressed by a website anymore. And certainly going through yours, I feel your culture, that genuine culture on, every one of those pages. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing, your concepts with our viewers and listeners today.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the invitation.
And looks like Greg Walters giving you a send off too. He says, great stuff. And that's awesome. So in respect for both your time and that of our viewers and listeners, hey, listen, cannot thank everyone enough for joining us for another episode of Level Up Live. And as I always like to say, until next time, keep learning. And Ken?
Keep leveling up.